Welcome to part two of functional programming in React. This is a video that I started, but in part one, and I kind of walked through what it looks like to start functional programming in React. But in this video, we're going to actually look at some code and some practical examples. If you need kind of a primer on how to get started, look at that one. Otherwise, this is the place to start. I'm going to start by just starting this little test app that I wrote. It's called Coffee Ratios. npm starting it. This was created using the Create React App TypeScript project. This is written in TypeScript, but even if you're not familiar with TypeScript, it should be pretty familiar looking to you. So the basic idea here is that you have different kinds of coffee. So like a cup cappuccino would have like a 2/3 foam and milk and espresso, whereas like an americano is just brewed coffee and espresso, or that sort of thing. And so you can actually just kind of click through all these different coffees, which if you look at the app itself, where these are coming from is I have these basically this fake API where it's pretending to fetch stuff. So this is fetching the coffees. So I'm getting the coffees right here from the data, and these are actually just hard coded right now, just for an example. But the idea is that you have like, for example, your latte, and it has different ingredients. The ingredients are in their own file. So like an ingredient with an ID of 1 is chocolate syrup, and it has a color, and that sort of thing. And so like these are all kind of built together, and that's kind of our basic like faux API that we're using. So if we go back here and look, you can actually heart a coffee, and this is just persisting in local storage. So like even if I refresh it or whatever, it's still there. And that's all done with these fake APIs I built up. So like there's a API called add to favorites, and that's where it gets added to local storage, and then also remove from favorites where it gets removed from local storage. So there's like some lower level components going on that do things like the styling of the components and stuff like that. But the main component we're going to be looking at today is this app component. So if you look at it right now, it is kind of written in a more object-oriented flavor. This is probably, if you've used React before, this is probably kind of familiar looking to you. So, it's a big class with a constructor, lots of methods like for getting coffee and getting your favorites, and those are called on component did mount. And then there's a method for toggling your favorites, and then there's a render method where everything gets rendered out, and that's basically how you would do it in an object-oriented kind of flavor. But what we're going to do today is we're going to take this class, and we're going to turn it into pure functions, and we're going to kind of use some different paradigms to do that with. So we're going to start out by installing some libraries that we're going to need. So I'm going to npm install, and we're going to do Ramda, which is that functional programming utility library. We're going to get Recompose, which is the React higher order components that you can kind of wrap and do functional stuff with. And then we're also going to get React functional lifecycle. And I'm going to save those. And once it installs those, I can start my server back up, and it will restart, and we can start actually programming. So it's restarting, and we're back. All right. So first things first, what we want to do is you see how we're exporting just a class. I'm going to import a couple things from Recompose. So compose and set state. or with state, sorry, from Recompose. And if you want to know what's available on Recompose, you can go to their docs, which is Recompose. Right here. So there's an entire API section. So if you go to like their main module here, you see this that says full API documentation, and it just kind of lists out all the different hardware components that they provide, and then we can tap into those and use them as needed. So anyway, let's go back here. It says that something expected. Oh, this is not spelled correctly. So now it says that compose is declared but never defined. By the way, these errors are coming from Typescript, so if you're not using Typescript, you won't be seeing all this, but it's kind of handy sometimes when you're building code. So we're gonna get compose, wrap our thing, and we're also pulling in with state, so that's gonna throw another error. But we're gonna get these states. This is the state that's currently on our class, and we're gonna move it outside of our class. So that the class can eventually become a pure function. So these are the things we want. So what we're going to do is we're going to comment those out, and I'm going to bring in a with state. And if you look at the with state in these docs, basically what it takes is a state name. So that's like the name of your state, which is state is kind of a weird thing here because it's really the state is going to be passed in as a prop because it's not actually local to your component. So it takes the name of the state and then a setter and then the initial state. So in this example, it has the counter and then set counter is 0, and then you can call set counter to change the value from 0 to something different. So what we're going to do is we're going to do set state, and what we're going to do is selected coffee, and we're going to make a setter called set selected coffee, the initial state of an empty string, or actually null, sorry. So that's the first one. That's this one right here. Then we're going to get the favorites. So I'm going to say with state favorites, and same thing, set favorites with an initial state of an empty object. And then last of all, we're going to say with state coffees and set coffees with the initial state of an empty array. Alright, so that's all we would need to do to set all of our states. It's gonna refresh and work now, but these things aren't actually being used at this point. So at this point, what we want to do is we want to we're going to go in and we're going to start kind of pulling out some of these methods and making this a functional component as opposed to a class component. So first of all, I'm going to take all the things that are in my my props, and I'm going to destructure props, so I can eventually just replace this all with this into the new props that I'm getting. So so now I can look for anywhere where there's this.props, which is nowhere, but that's fine because we're about to have some props. So you see here where it says this.state.coffees. Now this is going to be props.coffees because it's being passed in from above. You see where it says this.state.favorites, that can become props.favorites. Selected coffee is going to be props.selected coffee. We're going to get back to, actually, we don't have to get back to that one. So set selected coffee, you see here where it's doing set selected coffee. That actually is a prop now, and that's automatically just a setter, so we're not even going to have to do anything. Whereas you see here before, if you go up our set selected coffee was a method, and we actually had to call set state to actually set it. But none of this actually has to happen now because it's just a setter that we get automatically with Recompose. So next of all, we're going to go down. The state.selected coffee, that becomes props. The keys, the same thing. Favorites is the same thing. So let's see where else we have a this in our render method, because we want to get rid of all of those. It looks like the only other place is toggle favorites. So we're going to eventually be replacing that with a prop. So we'll just go ahead and say props.toggle is favorite, and we'll save that. And I know it doesn't look like it worked, but it did work. The reason that it doesn't look like there's anything here is because we're doing some work in our component did mount to actually get the coffees and favorites, which is fetching those from our fake API that I showed you. And so what we want to do is we want to move all this stuff outside of our class also. So I'm going to go ahead and first of all, we can get rid of that setter because we don't need that anymore. We can get rid of this stuff because we're not going to need any of those things anymore. And I'm going to take our get coffees and our get favorites, and we're going to move those out into pure functions. So take these out, and I'm going to say const.get favorites, and this is going to be a handler in React. So what we're going to do is we're going to use r.curry, which I think I told you in the previous video. Basically what r.curry does is say you have a function that takes an A and a B. So usually you would have to call foo and pass in an A and B like this, but with curry you could also do it like this. So it basically lets you pass in all the arguments, and once all the arguments are passed in, it finally executes it. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the props, and then we're also going to take the event, which we don't care about the event, but we're taking that because we want to make sure it executes. And the reason I'm doing this underscore here is because using TypeScript, if I don't have an underscore before my props or my parameters for my functions, it's going to throw an error saying that it's declared but not used. So here you see we're doing this.setState favorites, but what we want to do, if you go down here to favorites, there's this set favorites, and that's basically all we want to do. And so of course you could do props.set favorites and passing in the new favorites that we get after we call our API. But if you notice here, what's being returned from the promise being resolved is the favorites, and what's being passed in is just the favorites. So we could actually get rid of that this entire logic right here and just do props.set favorites. So that will always be called with what is responded to with the promise being resolved. Alright, so that's a definite improvement. We could also just get rid of this, the curly braces, and that'll just make this fetch favorites be explicitly returned, so it'll be more testable that way, so that we can actually just wait until this promise is resolved and then run tests. Okay, so we're going to do pretty much the same thing for the get coffees. So I'm going to say const get coffees, do an r.curry, take in the props and the event, and then once that get resolves, you see how it's doing the same thing with the set state and coffee. So what we can do, of course, is just do props.set coffees, and we can also do the explicit return here. Okay, so we've moved those two out. It says get favorites is declared but never used, which is true. So what we want to do now is we want to pull these in with a. Actually, we don't need a handler for that. That's just crazy. What we want to do is these are called on component did mount. So we're going to pull in component did mount from React functional lifecycle. Which, if you look at React functional lifecycle, this is actually a library I wrote. And it basically is just a wrapper. So you see here, you can either pass in an object with so you pull it in like functional from React functional lifecycle. You just pass in an object that you wrap your component with this stuff. Or the better way, which is how I always use it, is you can just take individual higher order components like should component update, and you can compose those together. So you see how we're pulling in compose here from Lodash, but it's exactly the same as the compose in Ramda. And so I'm doing should component update, and then it takes the props and the next props, and I can do comparison on them and see if it should update, or component will unmount. This takes props. So you see here, this is the list of all of them, what all they take and what should be executed with them. So we're going to go back here, and since we're already pulling in component did mount, what we can do is we can say component did mount, and that takes the props. If you look here, component did mount takes the props and a component, but we don't care about the component at all. So with the props, and then that's going to call get coffees, pass in our props to it, and get favorites, and pass in our props there. And actually, we don't even need an event. I was thinking this was going to be something that was triggered, but it's actually just something that it's called from component did mount. So we can actually get rid of this curry also. Simplify it a little bit, and we'll do the same over here. So we only want the props. We don't want a second argument there. Okay. So save that. And now we actually get some data back whenever it gets mounted, because those things are being called automatically. We can get rid of these two because that's what we just replicated. Also get rid of this component did mount because that's not necessary anymore. And now what we can do is we're going to take this toggle is favorite method that we have on our class component, and we're going to extrapolate that and move it down into our a function that we can call. So let's look at what's going on here. We're gonna pull this down and make it a thing we can call first of all. So we're gonna do now with this one. We actually do want to query this one because we want an event and a function. So we're going to query this one, take the props, and we're going to take the event, and then we're going to wrap that. And you see here, it's getting the ID from this.state.selected coffee. So whatever is selected, we know that's what we're either adding to our favorites or removing from our favorites. So selected coffee, of course, now is in our state, so that's a prop now. So we're going to do props.selected coffee instead of this.state. Same thing for favorites, that's in our props now, so props.favorites. And then you see here we're removing it from our favorites or adding it to our favorites. So that's doing a this.setState, which is not a thing anymore, but there is a set favorites. So what we can do, of course, using the same kind of thing where we're just doing props.set favorites, and that gets called with the favorites that are returned from the then. So we'll do the same thing down here, props.set favorites. And so at this point, this is something we can actually use. So what we want to do is pull in with handlers from Recompose. So with handlers, and that takes various handlers. So we go back to our Recompose docs. We look for with handlers. There it is. So that will take multiple handlers. Like, so this is a non-change event. So that's it takes the props first of all, and then it takes the event, and then it can update the value or on submit. So you can like apply multiple handlers that aren't executed until the second argument is called, which is exactly what we want here. Okay, so now it's yelling at us saying that it can't find R. So we are pulling in Ramda now, I believe. Yeah, so we're doing R.query here. So we actually need to pull in the Ramda library. So we're going to import all as R from Ramda. We'll recompile that, and it still works. Cool. Okay, so this toggle as favorite is no longer needed. We're going to get rid of that. And let's make sure that that still works. So yeah, we're still toggling. Okay, so now at this point we can actually pull this render function out like it's currently inside of a class. We can pull this out into be a function now. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy everything inside the return here. I'm just going to make a new function called app, which takes props. I'm just going to paste that, and we're going to get rid of the class. So you see here, this is now just a function that returns JSX. It takes the props and it returns everything based on what's inside of it. Alright, so now I'm going to save that, and it still works. So what we're going to do is, if you look at this toggle as favorite, it could actually use a little work, because it's, for one thing, it's using this if-else statement, which isn't great in functional programming. There's usually a better way to do something like that. So what we're going to do using the Ramda library is I'm going to check if it is a favorite based on whether the ID is in the favorites object, and if it is in the favorites object, then we want to remove it. Otherwise, we want to add it. You know, just a basic toggle kind of functionality. So we're going to make a new constant called set or update favorite. Yeah, update favorite. And for that we're going to do an r.ifelse. So what r.ifelse does, if you go to the Ramda docs, basically it takes some kind of equality thing. So this will basically just if it returns truthy with whatever's passed into it, then it'll go for the first one. And if it returns falsy, it'll go for the second one. So based on that, what we want to do is we want to say r dot equals true. So if whatever we're passing in is true, then we want to remove from favorites, and otherwise we want to add to favorites. What we're going to pass in, of course, is favorite. So what we're basically saying is if is favorite equals true, then remove it, otherwise add it. And these haven't been executed yet, so what we want to do at this point is we want to return update favorite, pass in the ID, and then just is identifiable. And so now we've gotten rid of our if and else. Let's see if it still works. It doesn't, which the reason it doesn't is because we need to wrap these with an always. So r.always, So if we don't wrap these in always, they get executed right away. That's kind of the takeaway here, which is not what you want. Okay, so now we go back here and I can toggle it, so that still works. Alright, a couple other things we could do. This is favorites. We could use r.path. This is just an array, so it basically lets us look at passing in. So we're going to pass in the props, and then we want to look at the favorites dot ID, whatever the ID is, inside of our object. So this is a little more fail-safe. So we could actually use kind of the same thing with selected coffee. We could say prop r.prop. So prop is the same as path basically, except instead of an array, we're just passing in a single prop. So we're just going to say selected coffee, pass in our props. So now that we have kind of like these ways to access these things, we could actually pull some of these out, like so they don't actually have to even reference Ramda. So I could actually pull out this whole function, and I could have a function called get selected coffee, and don't actually execute it. So it's just going to be something that when I do execute it, passing in the props, it'll kind of be the same thing. So this is now just kind of a function that I can call to get the selected coffee prop. I could pretty much do the same thing here with is favorite, except that I'm passing in a dynamic ID, and so I can't quite do it the same way. But it's still basically the same kind of concept, is that you would be able to pass in something and create a function based on that. Okay, so let's look at some other ways we can refactor this. One thing is that in this component did mount, you see how we're doing a we're taking the props and then we're calling both of these functions. Well, the thing is, it's kind of unnecessary for this to even be a function. A better way to do this would be to use r.compose. So you remember r.compose, it's a compose function. So basically you're taking multiple functions and composing them into a single function. So of course this is going to be executed by the props being passed into it. So so what we're going to do is we're going to compose it with get coffees and get favorites. Now the problem here out of the box with this approach is that get coffees and get favorites are returning promises. They're not returning the props. So whenever it's executed, get favorites is going to return a promise to get coffees, and then get coffees is expecting props. So what we have to do is we're going to wrap that in an r.tap. So what r.tap does, if you go to the Ramda documentation and search for tap, so what that does is instead of, so it takes the function, and instead of returning what the function returns, it actually returns a whatever prop you're wrapping it in. So what we're going to do here is we're going to do r.tap and r.tap. So both of these are now returning props instead of what we're passing back from it. So that still works, but now this whole area is already tested. If you're just testing this big component, like it doesn't have to call that function individually now. Okay, so a few other things. One thing is this OnClick function here. You see how we're when there's a click that happens on the thumbnail, it's passing in the coffee ID, which it's kind of mapping over, and it's calling set selected coffee on that. So the thing is, it's really hard to get to this function to test this in isolation because it's inside of the JSX component. So I mean, there are ways to get into these with with things like jest, but it's not great. And so an easier way to do it, if you want to just have a component that like you just test that like the component renders and doesn't explode, is that you would want to do something like this. So we're going to do another r.compose. You'll see a lot of these if you get into functional programming, because composition is really important. And what we're going to do is we're going to call props.set selected coffee, but we want this to always be executed with whatever the coffee ID is, not whatever event's being fired. So right now, if this was called, it would be called with the event that's triggered from the OnClick function, or the OnClick method. So what we really want to do is we want to pass in the coffee ID. So I'm going to do r.always and pass in coffee.id. So this overwrites whatever props being passed in to the function, and then it passes in the coffee ID instead to set selected coffee. So get rid of all this, save it, and that still works. And so at this point, this function completely executes on its own almost. You could, of course, Ramda has some built-ins for even mapping and stuff like that, but I don't feel like that's necessarily, because you probably want to test that this is actually passing in real coffees, and so you would want to pass coffees in with this inside of your tests. So yeah, this is basically how you would refactor a class component into a function component, and there are probably more things you could do to make it even better, but this is kind of the approach I usually take with functional programming in React, and I feel like it's been really valuable, and using this kind of approach is really cool for building really scalable small components. And you can actually build like these functional components in isolation, so that's a really cool benefit of it too, is that like usually I build all of my functional components inside of React Storybook, and then I just pull those in, and my actual app logic is all outside, and this kind of thing. So I hope you have enjoyed this. I hope it's been informative, and if you have any questions, feel free to hit me up. Appreciate it.